Welcome to the Friday Focus podcast. Rudyard Griffiths here, the chair of the Munk Debates. It is the 28th of March, and I'm joined by Janice Gross Stein, the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Janice, another consequential week at home and abroad. We're going to unpack it all with you. But before we do that, let's just thank some of the fantastic Munk supporters that have come on board to donate to the Munk Debates over the last 7 days in aid of our efforts to convene civil and substantive debate on the big questions of the day. So a big thank you to Alexandria, to Divyesh, to Anne, to Doreen, and Elizabeth. 5 fantastic women. That's amazing, Janice.
Thank you indeed.
Yeah. Well, let's start with, I think, what everybody is buzzing about. An announcement on global auto tariffs out of the White House that will see a fairly significant levy, 25%, against not just auto manufacturers in Europe and Asia, but Canada too. Some detail here that will kind of sift through that the tariffs will not come into effect immediately and in full force, and they're maybe all kinds of complicated calculations that have to be figured out in terms of how many parts in a car crossing the border are made in America or not. But regardless, Janice, it's another significant targeted tariff that takes aim at this time, not aluminum, not the steel industry. Those already have 25% tariffs levied against them here in Canada, but the auto sector.
It for sure is, Rudyard. And of course, this hits Canada really hard. Auto exports are our second biggest export to the United States. But the point you made matters here because the tariff is not only on cars, finished cars, they're on all the parts as they cross back and forth across the border. And a component part crosses the border 8 to 9 times. How they're going to impose tariffs on that each time they cross the border. And Rudyard, how does this all add up if there's steel and aluminum in those parts? The nightmare world, you tax the steel that's in the parts, you then tax the part more than once as it crosses the border. And then you figure out if this is covered or exempt in CUSMA, the free trade agreement that Donald Trump signed with us. And when we get to the next piece next week, you can have tariffs that, if you actually add them up, are pushing somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50%.
Yeah.
Those are crippling.
Yeah. Look, we always like to have a little bit of debate on the program. I'm very sympathetic towards, the tariffs that have been leveled against Canadian steel and aluminum manufacturers. I think they're egregious, and they're completely not in the interest of the United States in terms of its supposed objectives for these tariffs, which is to provide America with the key components to shore up its military-industrial complex, the supply chains that feed it, et cetera, et cetera. I think the thing with the auto sector we have to acknowledge, Janice, is that this is a industry focused in one province, Ontario, that has been in decline steadily over the last 20 years, with fewer and fewer cars made every year. And with the exception of, some high-paid union jobs in a few plants, the reality is a lot of the industry is parts manufacturers, and those are relatively unskilled, lower-paid work. It is not the kind of high productivity, high tech manufacturing that Canada so obviously needs. And I wonder, Janice, we react to these tariffs very emotionally. Mark Carney is already announcing this week $2 billion in taxpayer subsidies to the industry. This is on top of $50 billion that the Trudeau government put into EV plants, which now look largely obsolete. At what point do we acknowledge that the auto sector is the 21st century equivalent of the 20th century cod fishery, and we just get out of it? We get out of this business and we get into things where we are actually engaged in high-tech manufacturing. We are actually engaged in enhancing Canadian productivity and wealth creation, as opposed to just doing what we seem to love to do in Canada, which is find an industry, hope it's heavily unionized, and then subsidize the heck out of it.
Look, I'm sympathetic to your argument too, Roger, but last week, or a couple of weeks ago, you were talking about how important not only advanced manufacturing jobs are, but having a manufacturing sector. Some of the jobs in any manufacturing sector are going to be lower skilled. Those are still good jobs for people. And in fact, the auto parts industry provides jobs for people who, were this industry to close, it would be quite difficult to retrain and to adjust. So when we look at, what government does for people, when it works for people, cutting off the whole lower skilled sector and saying these are obsolete industries. Well, car manufacturing in North America is really not obsolete. How have we coped with this? We know how we coped with it. Tariffs against Chinese cars. Get out of the sector? What would that really look like? That would mean that North America drove Chinese cars, frankly. So I think there are arguments to be made here that is overwhelmingly in the U.S. interest. But this is not about getting out of the sector. This is about what we talked about on this program, forcing these parts manufacturers, many, Linamar in Canada, Magna, to move production from Ontario to the United States, to the Rust Belt, which faces similar kinds of challenges. That's what this really is about. It violates an agreement that was negotiated painstakingly in the first Trump administration. I don't have any sympathy for it.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Linamar because it's a big parts manufacturer. People on the Linamar production lines make $20, $30 an hour, Janice. These again, are low-skilled, comparatively low-paying jobs that unfortunately a lot of immigrants are forced to take because other people don't want to work there because the pay is not great. And hey, it ain't too fun working on an assembly line, punching out car parts. The mining sector, we haven't built a mine in this country, a major mine, in a decade because of overregulation. Yeah. The mining sector, in the next 5 to 10 years, will need 200,000 workers to replace the job losses that are expected through retirement in that sector. Because, hey, people don't want to go into mining. That's tough. That can be tough work too. And it's perceived of as somehow dirty because it's associated with resource extraction. Look, our economy is going to need to go through an adjustment. These tariffs are going to, be tough on some industries like cars. And instead of doubling down on a dying industry, what about picking an industry like mining where it's one of our major export industries to the rest of the world, not to the United States. We export gold, we export precious metals, rare metals all around the world. And yet here we go, doubling down on an industry that is, in serial decline, bound hand to foot to the United States. Yeah. When we could have the opportunity, just like those cod fisher people or whatever you're supposed to call them, we gave them a transition. We funded the ability for them to exit the cod fishery and find other jobs. Well, I think that's what we should be doing with the auto sector and some of these other industries that would actually be good to see Canada get out of because A, they're way too bound up in the United States. The supply chains all run north-south. And second, because the industries themselves are not healthy. They're not dynamic. They're not driving Canadian productivity gains. And they are serially addicted over decades to large-scale government subsidies, even to be sustainable in their current form?
Look, I think what you're talking about, Roger, is going to happen anyway, right? And so, um, if you just think forward 5, 7, 10 years, um, there'll be robots that in factories that are making these car parts. And by the way, there will be robots, humanoid robots, that will be going into the mines because we're already seeing that happen. So you are strategically right that 10 years from now, there will not be much Canadian employment in either of these sectors, frankly, in either mining or in car parts manufacturing, and we're going to have to figure it out. And you're also right that mining and exporting, if we do it in a reasonably sustainable way and don't despoil our own environment, and there's no reason we can't do it that way, um, frees us to some extent of our dependence on the United States, which is a strategic imperative. Let's look at the realities today, Roger. We're in the middle of an election, all right? You know, it would be suicide for any political leader right now, 10 days into a federal election, which is, by all intents and purposes, undecided, close, not to announce support for the auto industry. I have yet to meet that political leader who would do that from either party.
Well, look, I think Pierre Poilievre, to his credit, did not announce a $2 billion, just no strings attached, no objectives profiled for the money. Just here's $2 billion for Mark Carney because, hey, I guess politically I've got some votes I need to win, in Southern Ontario.
And I
Look,
can't afford to lose them or I lose this election. That's the truth.
Yeah, well, look,
And
it's
so,
time for the country to grow up. We're in a major moment here, a moment of real threat. And what have both these parties done over the first 5 days or so of this campaign? They've announced tax cuts for people's TFSAs, tax cuts for seniors, as
yeah.
if seniors in this country need more money. They've done tax cuts on people's personal incomes. None of this, Janice, addresses the real structural issues facing the country. There's been nothing on, guess what matters, levels of business taxation in Canada. They're increasingly deeply uncompetitive with the United States and other countries in the world. There's been nothing on investment and encouraging foreign direct investment in Canada by possibly spending what's now these parties. We've added it up here at the Hub this week. We've got a great column today by Theo Argydas. $20-odd billion that each one of these parties has spent putting money in people's pockets when we're supposedly in a national emergency, fighting for the country's very survival, and we're feathering our own nests. I mean, come on, this just is not serious.
Well, look, I'm going to argue back. It isn't serious. You're right. But again, I'm going to say we're in an election, and I don't want to hold either of those two leaders to an impossible standard. And let's talk for a minute about one thing, which is the tax-free savings account. What's the subsidy for? The subsidy is if you invest in Canadian companies. Well, that is not a bad thing when investor confidence is rattled by what Trump is doing and investment in Canadian companies is drying up. There's at least a certain coherence about that in the moment. The bigger point, unfortunately, is correct. We have to, when this election is over, which is not long from now, whichever party wins has to have a strategic approach to our economy. Because the adjustment that you talked about in the cod fishery, Rudyard, a decade. You remember how long that took and how painful it was. And when we begin to move out of legacy sectors, either because of the problem we're having with the United States, nobody minimizes that, or because of the technology that is changing the working environment, that is not an overnight shift. That will take years, and it is going to require support for the transition of people who are going to be left behind in these sectors. There's no question about it. These are large numbers of Canadians.
Well, let's, Janice, though, have a bit of time to talk about the Middle East. It's one of your deep areas of expertise, and there's been some big events there in the last 7 days. So, quick break, back on the other side with our Munk supporters and donors.